Section 25, Chapter 15 of the Life and Adventures of Kit Carson. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Dion Gines. The Life and Adventures of Kit Carson by DeWitt C. Peters. Section 25, Chapter 15, Part 2. Besides the many dangers to his flock which a person runs the risk of, both from the numerous accidents to which it is liable, and the unwelcome visits of the Indians when thus traveling, there are others which may occasionally happen to his own person. He may be, while standing guard, suddenly attacked and bitten by a mad wolf. On this event occurring, he is almost certain to be seized with that terrible, and we might as well add incurable disease, hydrophobia, which renders him a most pitiful object to behold. From a human being so recently respected and beloved by his companions, a person, thus unfortunate, is suddenly changed into an object most dreaded and detested. A party of Mexicans in charge of a large herd of sheep a few years since were bound to California. One night a large ferocious wolf entered the camp, and bit a man in the leg. Symptoms of hydrophobia very soon set in, and in a short time the victim was a confirmed case of the disease. His comrades had no proper means of taking care of and transporting him, as they were hundreds of miles from the nearest house. They were superstitious, and believed that all would die if they kept the man's company any longer. Accordingly, they drove a stake in the ground, to which they inhumanly secured him, and after depositing a small allowance of provisions near by, they left him to die. Human bones were afterwards found near the identical spot where it was said this unfortunate incident happened, which afforded strong circumstantial evidence that the man had eked out a miserable existence soon after he was deserted by his so-called friends, and also that the truth of this story rested upon strong probability. When the Americans first obtained possession of New Mexico, sheep could be bought at the rate of 25 cents per head. The reason of this was the want of a market and the ease with which they were raised. Cheapness of labor also assisted in reducing their value. The wool of these sheep was rather coarse, resembling hair more than wool. The only use in which it was employed was for manufacturing blankets, rough carpet, and in filling mattresses. The valley of the Rio Grande is wonderful as a sheep growing country. The mountain districts also cannot be excelled in this respect. Their fitness for grazing is best exemplified by their abounding in the famous Rocky Mountain sheep. In many respects this animal resembles the chamois. They live on the tops of the highest peaks, eat the tenderest grass, and produce the finest flavored mutton in the world. One of their heads, with the horns, often weighs 100 pounds. To shoot them requires all of an experienced hunter's skill, and when he has brought down one of these trophies, he feels he has done more than if he had killed 10 deer. The sight of one of these mountain sheep, as perched on a high, rocky peak, is beautiful. The hostile Indians are the main drawback in New Mexico to the successful raising of sheep. The usual modus operandi employed by Mexican herders, who cannot be surpassed in their vocation, to which they appear to take intuitively, although many of them serve an apprenticeship at it, which begins with early life and ends only by death, is, to send a youth who leads a goat in advance of the flock. From some strange and unaccountable reason, the sheep will follow after him even to the crossing of rivers whose currents are deep and swift. The shepherds, with their dogs to assist them when necessary, allow the herd to scatter over a space varying in its size, but always allowing sufficient area so that the animals can move on at their ease and at the same time be able to feed. The danger above all others that is to be apprehended and guarded against while thus traveling is crowding, for in this manner, when journeying through deep gorges in the mountains and over the precipitous banks of rivers, hundreds of sheep can be, and not unfrequently are, smothered. When this crowding commences, it is next to impossible to arrest it. A sort of panic prevails over the entire herd, and they rush on, one on top of another, until a mass of dead and dying is thus piled up and a barrier is made; or else, until, as most frequently happens, a bridge of carcasses is formed over which the survivors pass in safety. The Indians who inhabit the country on the various routes to California have a strong predilection for mutton, which is a fact to bear in mind when migrating with this sort of property. Such accidents as having a few sheep bitten by rattlesnakes, and also a certain percentage becoming footsore and breaking down from fatigue, are common to every herd that crosses the Rocky Mountains. Economy in living is the great fundamental principle among the lower classes of the Mexicans. Therefore, when a sheep is going to die from fatigue or any simple disease, natural death is anticipated by the herders with the aid of a hunting knife, and the meat, being dressed and cooked, is unhesitatingly eaten by them. Next to the Mexican shepherd, his dog, although he is not generally a handsome animal, is found to be ever faithful in guarding the flocks. The greatest enemy to the herds is the wolf, and in keeping them at bay and preventing their inroads by night, the dog is capable of performing valuable service. Hence, no band of sheep should cross the plains and mountains without a full complement of them. It was at one of the frontier towns of California that Kit Carson disposed of his flock. There, having heard of the rapid and marvelous growth of San Francisco, he made up his mind to verify these reports with his own eyes, for he was well acquainted with its ancient aspect. San Francisco had since the year 1848 to grow under the impulse of the gold fever. Kit Carson remembered it, a Spanish settlement as it existed in 1845 6 7, then containing not over 200 inhabitants. In 1847 the first gold discovery was made at Sutter's Fort. In 2 months thereafter, about $250,000 in gold dust were carried into the town. The next 2 months, $600,000 more. In February, 1849, the population of the town was 2,000. In the 6 months following, it increased to 5,000. In the early part of the year 1850, the population had increased to nearly 20,000. In 1852, according to the census, it was 34,870. The first settlement made at San Francisco was commenced in the year 1776. The place was then called Yerba Buena, or Good Herb, from the fact that an herb of that name, which was supposed to have great medicinal value, grew in rich luxuriance over the surrounding country. The houses were at first built of adobes, or sun-dried bricks. It is now one of the most important cities on the western continent. As Kit Carson neared this great emporium of California, possessed of some of the details of its astonishing growth, and remembering it as it existed when its inhabitants could be easily counted in an hour, he was perfectly astonished to behold the great changes which a few short years had produced. Had it not been for the immovable landmarks about the city and the familiar scenery of the bay, he would have been entirely at a loss in considering that this was the spot, called San Francisco, which he had visited in former years. This metropolis, however, like all others, presented few attractions to Kit Carson's vision, further than its objects of curiosity, which were a source of interest and amusement to him. When he had finished sightseeing, he was ready and anxious to be on his way to New Mexico. Previous to his setting out, he went on business to Sacramento City. While there, he received a message from his friend and partner Maxwell, asking him to wait until the latter could come in with a herd of sheep from Carson River, when they would join forces and return home together. Kit Carson's stay in California was shortened by the annoyance, as he considered it, of being made a lion. His society was constantly courted by men whom he had never seen. He was passed free on steamboats and to all places of public amusement, and, in fact, the people, in acknowledging his worth, treated him with marked distinction. He was pointed out wherever he went as a man who had done the state great service. This reward of his merit was indeed a just tribute to his worth. Kit felt himself highly honored and favored, but he did not expect or wish such attention. He felt himself to be a humble individual, who had honestly and faithfully performed his duty, as it had been assigned to him, and his modesty would not allow him to ask or be willing to receive any other than the unexpressed opinion of the people. There were some men, there always are such persons in every community, who sought his company, expecting to hear him boast of his deeds and proclaim himself a hero such as had never before existed. But what must have been their surprise on seeing his unassuming bearing, his disregard of notoriety, and his anxiety to escape that popularity which they themselves would have highly prized. Tired by the anxiety and hard work of bringing his property over a long and dangerous journey to a good market, he had looked for rest and retirement, but instead he was everywhere sought out and made conspicuous. And here we pause to speak of the noble qualities of moral character and good judgment evinced by Kit Carson on this occasion of his eventful life. He found himself surrounded with the choice spirits of the new El Dorado, his name a prestige of strength and position, and his society courted by everybody. The siren voice of pleasure failed not to speak in his ear her most flattering invitations. Good fellowship took him incessantly by the hand, desiring to lead him into the paths of dissipation. But the gay vortex, with all its brilliancy, had no attractions for him. The wine cup, with its sparkling arguments, failed to convince his calm earnestness of character that his simple habits of life needed remodeling. To the storm, however, he was exposed; but, like a good ship during the gale, he weathered the fierce blast, and finally took his departure from the new city of a day, with his character untarnished, but nevertheless leaving behind him many golden opinions. With a hurried farewell and many kind remembrances of the good people of California, he left their great city to return to a home where he was certain to find a life better suited to his tastes. Money getting had no charms for him. Had he chosen to accept some of the offers made him while then in San Francisco, he could easily have amassed an immense fortune. But his home had now the greater allurements, and a legitimate business gave him the certainty of comfort. The power merely which wealth assumes, Kit Carson never has desired to grasp. The time had nearly arrived for the appearance of Maxwell. He finally joined Kit Carson, when the two immediately engaged in the very profitable work of the disposing of their sheep. The market proved to be quite active, so much so that they disposed of their entire flock at high cash values without the least difficulty. The speculation thus proved to be highly satisfactory to all concerned. In a monetary point of view, the adventure proved to be the most fortunate in which Kit Carson had been engaged. Heretofore, money had been a second consideration with Kit Carson. He had directed his energies and attention to almost everything, or at least to many things besides its accumulation. The sum which he had received for the important services rendered both to government officers and private individuals had been expended on the wants of his family and on his suffering friends and countrymen. A trifling amount had always sufficed to satisfy his own immediate desires. The calls upon his purse at the end of each year had left, therefore, but little which he could call his own. The snug sum now at his disposal, Kit Carson determined to lay by, and, serving as a nucleus around it, he has since accumulated enough amply to supply those comforts which will tend in his old age to make him happy. Maxwell and Carson decided to return to their homes by the southern route which runs through the country on and adjacent to the Rio Gila. Maxwell determined to take a steamer down the coast as far as Los Angeles, distant from San Francisco about 350 miles, and used his best endeavors to persuade his friend Kit Carson to accompany him. In this, however, he failed. Already one cruise over a part of the ocean route which Maxwell contemplated making had been made by Kit Carson in 1846, and which had so sickened him of sea life that he resolved never to travel on salt water again, while it was in his power to obtain a mule to assist him in journeying by land. Maxwell, by his water conveyance, reached Los Angeles 15 days in advance of Kit Carson, and employed himself in making the necessary preparations for their trip to New Mexico. When Kit rejoined his companion, everything was in readiness for them to proceed on their route, and in a day or so afterwards they started. Everything favored them until they reached a village belonging to some Pimo Indians. and located on the Rio Gila. Here the grass became suddenly very scarce. They learned from these Indians that the season had been unusually dry, and that, if they attempted to proceed on the regular trail, they would do so at the risk of losing their animals by starvation. While undecided as to which was the best course to pursue, Kit Carson informed the party that he would guide them over a new route, which, though difficult and rough to travel, he felt confident would afford sufficient forage to answer all their purposes. At once the men agreed to be governed by their experienced friend's advice, and having signified to them their willingness to do so, they resumed their march, following up the Rio Gila until they came to the mouth of the San Pedro, when they struck out the latter for 3 days, and then parted with it, to risk the chances of reaching, at the end of each day, the small mountain creeks that lay on their contemplated route. After traveling in as direct a course as the nature of the country would admit, they arrived seasonably at the copper mines of New Mexico. While pursuing this experimental journey, Kit Carson, who was well acquainted with the general outline of the country, but was not equally conversant with it in reference to the certainty of finding eligible camping sites, where wood, water, and grass presented themselves in abundance, was frequently made the subject of a tantalizing joke by the men of the party. Occasionally his memory would not solve the question, "What is the next course?" He had neither map, chart, nor compass, and depended entirely upon old landmarks. Occasionally the resemblance of different mountains, one to another, would serve to embarrass him. For a time he would become doubtful as to the exact course to pursue. At such moments the mischievous dispositions of the men would get the better of their judgment, and they would exert their lungs in shouting to him, as he spurred his riding animal to keep out of the sound of their raillery. He was not always successful in this, and occasionally a few sentences reached him, like the following: "Hurrah! I say, are you the famous Kit Carson, who knows this country so well? Are you really a good pilot, or are you lost?" These and similar expressions saluted Kit's ear, a language to which he had not been heretofore accustomed, as some impediment, such as a fallen tree, a rock, a swamp, or a creek stayed, for a brief period, his progress, thus allowing the party to approach within speaking distance. The remarks might have temporarily chafed his spirit, but he had too much good sense to allow his friends to see that they had gained any advantage over him. He rode boldly on, and answered their raillery with silence. He knew, however, very well that his turn would come, and when he had brought them in safety to a spot with which all were familiar, he turned the tables on them by retorting to their questions in a playful manner, which made their future interpretation of his occasional doubts less sweeping in its conclusions. Kit succeeded in guiding the party safely to the copper mines, from whence their route was plain. From the copper mines the party traveled through to the Rio del Norte. This river is 1,800 miles in length, and forms the boundary line between Texas and Mexico. It takes its rise in the Rocky Mountains and empties into the Gulf of Mexico. It is navigable for small steamers, sloops, and schooners, for a distance of about 450 miles from its mouth. About 900 miles from its mouth there is a spot where the river is only about 3 or 4 feet deep. Here the Apache and Comanche Indians always cross when in their depredatory tramps into Mexico. Leaving the Rio Grande or del Norte, the party pursued their homeward route through the settlements of the Rio Abajo and Santa Fé, and finally reached Taos on the 23rd day of December, 1853. Soon the party entered the territory of New Mexico. Kit Carson accidentally met the Mormon delegate to Congress. That person informed Kit Carson that the appointment of an Indian agent had been conferred upon him. On learning this piece of intelligence, Kit was much elated. He felt that the office was perfectly suited to his tastes, and he was honestly impressed with the belief that he was capable of performing the duties of this office, and of accomplishing much good. His happiness and pride were heightened by thinking that, finally, his services had met the approbation of his government, the substantial proof of which was the offering to him of an important trust without solicitation on his part. Immediately on arriving at Taos he wrote an answer to the authorities at Washington, in which he expressed his willingness to serve the government and the pleasure he felt in accepting the office. At the same time he sent the necessary bond required of persons who hold this appointment. Hardly had Kit Carson been ushered into his new duties before the Jicarilla Apaches, who formed one of the tribes of his agency, began to show new signs of dissatisfaction by committing various kinds of outrages on the property and lives of the citizens of the northern part of New Mexico. To arrest them in their career and make them amenable for the crimes which they had already committed, Lieutenant Bell, of the 2nd Regiment of the United States Dragoons, was sent in quest of them. He found them on the Red River, and at once commenced operations against them. At first these red men were equally ready to break a lance in combat with their foes, but, after the soldiers had made 2 charges and penetrated through and through their ranks, they were, although in superior numbers, glad to give up the mastership of the field and run away. In this fight the Apaches lost, by his being killed, one of their great chiefs, besides many warriors. On the side of the soldiers 2 men were killed and several seriously wounded. A short time after the news of this skirmish had reached Taos, Kit Carson found it necessary, in order to attend to some official business, to proceed to Santa Fé; but, just as he was on the point of setting out, he was informed that a large party of these Jicarilla Apaches had recently arrived at a place in the mountains only about 20 miles from Taos, and there were encamped. With the view of pacifying them if it was possible, Kit Carson immediately posted thither, and, with no small degree of peril attending his movements, for he went unattended, and among Indians who were at the time very bitter against the whites, he confronted their head men in their den. He needed no introduction, for during many years he had been well known to them. Therefore he proceeded at once to business. After passing through the usual Indian salutations, he commenced by haranguing them in a style that most pleases their fancy, thereby fixing their attention on what he was saying. Among other things, he forewarned them that the course they were pursuing, if persisted in, would prove the cause of their being exterminated, as their Great Father the President had at his disposal thousands of soldiers to replace those who fell in battle, while, when their warriors were killed, they could not immediately place others in their moccasins. When a warrior was killed, they were compelled to wait until their children grew up. He added that the Great Father loved his red children, and through him, whose servant he was, he wished to give them annuities and otherwise aid them in living at peace. These Indians, on learning that Kit Carson was their agent, expressed great pleasure, and at his earnest solicitation came forward and professed friendship. So little reliance, however, was to be placed in this tribe that Kit Carson doubted their sincerity. Although he exacted every pledge which he thought would in the least tend to bind them to their promises, he feared they would not prove true. Having finished his business, Kit bent his way to Santa Fé, but he had not more than reached there before he heard that the Jicarillas had already become tired of the restraints which he had placed upon them, and had broken out in open defiance of the authorities. From this time onward, so thick and fast did their wicked crimes increase, that coercive measures became necessary to put them down. This finally resulted in as sanguinary a battle being fought between a small band of soldiers and this tribe as was ever recorded. A rapid sketch of it must suffice to illustrate to the reader what kind of a fight this was, and what plucky fellows the Apaches are. Lieutenant J.W. Davidson, with a command of 60 men, belonging to F and I companies of the 1st Regiment of the United States Dragoons, was ordered out to seek and act against these red men. Both the soldiers and their officers were renowned for their bravery and experience in Indian mode of warfare. Hence, more than ordinary deeds were expected to be performed by them. The result will show that they did not disappoint any reasonable expectation. Lieutenant Davidson marched to the Ambuda Mountains, which range lies between 15 and 20 miles southwest of Taos, as he had been informed by good authority that the Indians were to be found there. On reaching the mountains he soon came upon the savages, and found them fully prepared to meet him. They had selected their ground with great skill. The site which they had chosen was upon a high elevation, and at the first glance to get at them appeared to be an impossibility, on account of the roughness of the country. If the Indians had hunted over the whole of the Rocky Mountains, they could not have hit upon a place that offered them so many advantages for the use to which they intended to put it. But, as the red men had, by great labor, reached the tops of the crags, therefore the soldiers resolved not to be outdone, even if they had to be the assaulting party. Chapter 15, Part 2. Recording by Dion Johns, Salt Lake City, Utah.